Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and I'm excited to introduce you to Ron Tank today. We're going to be talking about negotiating the stock market and other investments. So welcome, Ron. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. Good to be with you.
And for those of you who may not know Ron yet, Ron Tank's the author of The Moses of Wall Street. Love the title of that, by the way. And creator of the Bulletproof Investor and Triple Tank System. He's all about investing the right way for the right reasons. And within 30 years personal investing experience in the stock market and being 30 years as a Sunday school teacher, I think he knows a thing or two about that. So he coaches new and experienced investors on how to eliminate risk, maximize returns on the stock market, which we could all use a little help with, I'm sure, and offering a pretty unique combination of field-proven strategy, real-life tested biblical advice. And yes, you heard that right, biblical advice as a longtime Sunday school teacher, and some practical tips that successful investors need to be able to win in today's pretty volatile financial markets. So, Ron, I got to ask, speak to the elephant in the room. How did you come to combine Bible studies with investment on the stock market? That seems like a very unlikely pairing.
Yeah, it seems like an accident. I would think, Cindy, it wasn't planned. I can tell you that for a fact. It was not planned. But the Bible part of it came in when I was invited by my pastor to teach Sunday school in around about 2009. And as it turned out, I was a full-time investor at that point.
Mm.
And what I discovered was to be a Sunday school teacher, you've got to read the Bible. It's one of those givens. You have to be
Yep.
educated a little bit if you're going to be the teacher. And by the way, one of the ways I've known to become if you really want to know something well, is to teach it.
Yeah.
And I discovered that in Sunday school, and it just kind of came about. And the Moses Wall Street came about because of that. I ended up kind of discovering a methodology that I spent several years researching that proved to be a good foundation for a system. So I've kind of found out that, psychologically, the market is pretty tough on people. It's probably more tough on people psychologically than it is any other thing. And the Bible
Yeah.
has lots to say about that. So it's a good grounding tool to keep you on the right track. Kind of you'll learn to beat down greed and fear and pride of your opinion
Yeah.
and all the things that tend to derail us. And the Bible has a lot to say about that, and it'll help steer you along.
Okay, well, I want to dig in on that, but you mentioned about psychology, and it tweaked for me because I often say that the first and most important negotiation is negotiating our own mindset. I personally find the idea of investing in the stock market pretty intimidating. So I'd love any tips you have or thoughts on, how can we negotiate our mindset to maximize our effectiveness in investing and jump into the game with confidence?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot to be said right there, Cindy. I could probably talk for 15 minutes alone on that. But it's the psychological part is important because, and I've learned that there's non-negotiables that I put into play
Yeah.
when it comes to investing. And I just say, you know what, these are just not going to be negotiated upon. And the reason for it is I've learned from a lot of the other people that have been involved in the stock market for a long time. And if you've been there for a long time, there's a reason you've made it a long time.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think the biggest reason, Cindy, is that they have non-negotiables, that they just say, this is a rule, and
Yeah.
I do not negotiate with myself. I do not allow myself to break this rule, one of which is cutting losses quickly and not letting losses get large at any given time. And I found that guys that survive, they just don't negotiate with that rule. Every time, Cindy, I've heard a guy break that rule, he's negotiated himself, and he negotiated with himself
Yeah.
to break that rule. He thought he had a good reason. So he started negotiating with himself, going, well, I know you made this rule, but I don't think that rule should apply right now.
Yeah.
And you give yourself reasons why.
Yeah.
And it sounded pretty good to you at the time. You come up
Yeah.
with them if you want to. But when they've done that, it's every time guys have done that, it has hurt them badly.
Okay.
And
Before you go to the next one, because I want to hear about your non-negotiables, I think this is a great sort of format and easy for our listeners to understand as well. So if I hear you right, that first non-negotiable is, hey, cut your losses. Like when you get those losses, don't keep, and that tweaks for me and for our listeners out there in terms of negotiation biases, it's called sunken cost bias, because we do have a tendency in life and negotiations, if we've already invested something, we tend to be very reluctant to walk away from it, and we keep throwing more good money after bad. So do you agree that applies, Ron, in your
Yeah, no, I agree exactly. They have a saying about the stock market is you marry your wife, you don't marry stocks.
Yeah.
But sometimes people, that sunken cost, you don't want to, it brings a feeling of being wrong, or that, hey,
Yes.
I've invested some time and energy into this
Yeah.
and it isn't working, and we don't like to admit it isn't working. And one of the worst things, even, Cindy, is people will add to that sunken cost
Yeah.
because they think the market's wrong. And they'll
Yes.
say, well, I think the market just has that wrong right now, so I'm going to add some to it and
Yeah.
bring my cost down. And
Oh,
they get a bigger ship that's sinking now instead of a smaller ship. It becomes bigger and it's still sinking, and it doesn't
yeah.
work.
And isn't that applicable across the board, right? Certainly, that's news to me, and I'm glad to hear that that applies sort of for investments in the stock market. But also, you see it with people, with employees. When you've got an employee who you know is just not going to be a good fit, but we've already invested time training, and we just keep at it. Relationships, personally, when you know things are just going sideways, but we just keep investing that time. So what are a few other non-negotiables for you, Ron?
Well, a big one for me, Cindy, is that there has to be a proven method. So most of the people that I know that get involved, so if you were going to handle your own money in the market a little bit, you have to have a way of going about that. And sometimes people just kind of go at it haphazardly, but I tell people, you got to invest as much energy into your education as you would for an engineering degree.
Yeah.
So if you were wanting to be an engineer, you wouldn't just get out of high school and say, hey,
Yeah.
I think I'll just go start building bridges, and maybe
Yeah.
some guy will hire me because I want to build bridges. You're probably going to have to know a thing or two, right, about engineering, and you would go invest some time and money in college. And I think that's one of my non-negotiables. If somebody wanted like to come to me and say, hey, Ron, would you teach me? I would say good, because he's willing to get an education. And I
Yeah.
would tell people to invest in that education before you get involved with the market, not
Yeah.
after.
Okay.
It'll be much cheaper because the market's going to make you pay for an education anyway. You might as well
Yeah.
reduce those costs a little bit, up front.
Absolutely. And now I know you suggest that investing is like sort of constructing a building. Can you explain that a bit? I think I read that somewhere. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, and I'd look at it from the standpoint as kind of like a builder would, I guess, and is that you have to have a foundation to start from. And that is back to that education that we just talked about. So having an education gives you a foundation to work from. At least you've got a starting point.
Yeah.
And hopefully that education has come based on, proven facts and people that have done things and can share with you how they've done them, why they did them that way, why they worked. And that's kind of how I started in the beginning. So I get a foundation and then learn to build from that. And from there, you'll add things to that foundation. One of the things that's another non-negotiable, Cindy, of mine is I don't, and most of the people that come to me feel the same way, is I won't trade my values or my faith.
Yeah.
And I keep that right at the top. Those are another non-negotiable, where I say, I'm going to keep myself in check of fear and greed and pride of my own opinion. I don't, people don't like to be wrong. So I'm going to add that as a non-negotiable. I can't allow myself. So you say, well, how do I add a floor to that? You have to say, well, you've got to recognize that even after you have an education and you could go put this to work now, and you could go pick stocks and you can analyze the markets and know what's going on out there, you've got to realize that you become your own worst enemy, and that fear and greed and pride might kick in. So how can I recognize when pride is, well, let's take greed. How can we know when greed is coming into play? It's if I have a rule that says there's certain times when I need to be selling a stock that's maybe, and it's still going up and acting really well, you might actually be doing pretty well, but a rule might kick in that you have that says, if I see this happening in a stock on the way up, I need to start doing something about it, which means I need to start selling that. And if you don't have a rule, how do you know if you're being greedy or not? Because what happens to people, they see things working, just like a lot of these bull markets end on, they end on a big note to the upside. And if they don't recognize it, that they could be tempted into being greedy and wanting to make more money and faster. And you say, boy, this is working so good, I'm just going to stay forever. I'm going to start throwing more money at it. It's working so great. And but if you don't have a rule, that's what you might do, and find yourself on the way back down, still hoping it gets better, and you just don't have any idea to know that you're being greedy unless you're breaking rules.
So is that what you mean by that structure then, Ron? Like you've got these systems in place, you've got these rules in place, and they're based on solid education and experience, so that then if you stick to that sort of construction, you're going to be increasing your chances of coming out okay. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and as you go, you'll start to add some floors, so you'll recognize hey, did I just pass that floor up that was about pride?
Yeah.
Am I starting to brag about how well I might be doing in the market? So you really kind of have to self-check what you're saying and what you're thinking and what you're doing to recognize whether or not you're on a floor that's getting dangerous. You might be a
Yeah.
little bit too high up and maybe you're ignoring certain things that could leave you trapped in a fire in that building, you know,
Yeah.
so to speak. So you just got to really work your way. You can't get to the top unless you have a good set of directions, but you got to learn to follow them too, you know,
Yeah.
and recognize where you're at in the building and how well am I managing myself as I'm moving up through this process of learning to invest my money and handle it right.
I like that construction sort of metaphor, because yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking of even occupational health and safety. You got to tie off on every floor, right? So it's like having those secure sort of rules in place. And if you get fast and loose with that and you don't tie yourself off, then you're put yourself at risk of a fall. I think
It's dangerous. Yes.
a great analogy. Now, on the psychology piece, you had talked about greed, and you had mentioned fear earlier as well. Like, how do we negotiate past our fears? So for someone like me who finds it really intimidating, so I get that education, any other sort of mindset tips about how we negotiate past the fear and deciding to get into dabble in the stock market?
Well, there's certain things, there's a lot of things there, Cindy, that come to mind. One just came to mind for me when I started was I had a passion for for the markets, you know, and it was driving me towards it. So a lot of times I think, you know, it's easier to beat fear if you have some passion involved in what it is you want to do. That tends to push that fear out of the way because the desire starts to become overbearing and it starts to push that fear away. I've also realized that knowledge, so having a system to employ, because a lot of people are afraid because they just go, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Well, okay, well, I can solve that with some knowledge. So I'll get a basics of that. That helps kind of downplay, you know, the fear, I think, as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's like knowing what a dangerous snake is. If you don't know and you run into a snake, then is he going to bite me and kill me? I don't know. I don't know if it's poisonous or not, you know. So an education, I think, is real helpful, having the passion there, having a system in place, a set of rules. So you start to, it's kind of like building the building, Cindy. I think of gathering the pieces. You know, you say, well, if I'm going to have a foundation, I might need to pour concrete. I might need some rebar. You know, I'm going to need some certain parts and pieces to this foundation in order to even get started. And as you gather them up, I think the fear starts to dissipate. You know, the passion takes over. You start to see, hey, there is a process by which I can operate. And now that I know that process, the key is can I get it over it myself?
Yeah.
So I'm not afraid. Most people, I think, Cindy, and I might be off track a little, they're afraid of themselves.
Yes. Oh, though you're not off track. I think absolutely. We've got that, we have that inner critic. I think we often fear success even, right? I mean, so few people really analyze what they want in a meaningful way in terms of the outcomes at every level, right? And so I love so much of what you said there. That passion, I think that's great advice across the board. So I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners too. I mean, whether we're talking about investing in the stock market or in any negotiation that you're going to, when you can tap into your deep why and remind yourself about why you feel so strongly. It's like, even when people negotiate about money, they often say to me, there is no why, Cindy, it's just about the money. It's never just about the money, right? It's about what that money means for you. So I love that. And that foundational piece as well, as a way to push past the fear, reminds me, because I often advocate in any negotiation. So again, for our listeners, whether you're negotiating the stock market or in any negotiation, it's doing the prep work, because doing that preparation allows you to show up with confidence, and then you're going to get better outcomes when you show up with that confidence and push past the fear. And I was laughing, Rod, if you wondered why, when you said about the snake, because it just reminded me yesterday, our dog was out in the backyard and he started barking like crazy. We got a big shepherd, and it was obvious he had some animal there, and he kept kind of coming and poking at it, and he jumped back. And I said to my husband, get out there, like, what the heck? He hates snakes. And he's like, what if it's a snake? So as you said about watching out for getting bit by those snakes, I had an image of Dawn with the dog last night. Now, speaking
Now, speaking
of that gambling kind of piece, right, taking those chances, I remember you said somewhere that Wall Street isn't the same as like betting on racehorses. So how is it different than gambling? I think a lot of people see it as just this gigantic risk where you just take your chances. And I love that your perspective is different on that.
Yeah, well, two things come to mind on that, Cindy. Is one is the gambling, I think, is can the market, I don't look at the stock market as that it should be gambling. I think it can be. And I think people let it become
Yeah.
gambling by the way you handle it.
Yeah.
You know, so if you make a commitment to a stock and you buy it and it's not working and you're down 10%, you're just hoping it comes back. That's kind of like sitting at a racetrack, hoping your horse comes out of the next turn ahead. You know, you're just,
Yeah.
well, I hope he makes it around the current turn and passes that other horse. And that's just not a good, you know, I say hope is good as an investor, but it shouldn't be your primary strategy.
Yeah.
And a lot of people will say, well, Ron, the stock market's just too risky, you know, but here's a totally different take on that, Cindy. And I don't know if you've heard this from anybody else, but if somebody said, Ron, do you think the stock market's risky? I'd say, no, it's not. And they, huh? What do you mean?
Yeah.
All my commercials I hear on my TV say that I got to be able to lose everything. I might lose everything. You know, you got to be willing to lose it all. And I'm like, well, no, that's what you do at a racetrack. You got to be, because you probably will lose it all at a racetrack gambling. But well, the way I look at, Cindy, is risk is our ability, the market can only do to us what we allow it to.
Yeah.
So we, by taking, so what is risk? It's the possibility that an event or an activity could produce a loss. That probability of that happening. So can we minimize that? We can by cutting our losses. See, there's that first rule, and it says, you know what? The market can only hurt me if I let it.
Yeah.
And most people say, well, yeah, but Ron, that means I have to be right when I buy something. That's exactly right. You've got to learn how to fundamentally select out a stock that could be a big winner, and you've got to time your purchase correctly to prohibit that big loss. So if you do those two things right, you can increase vastly the odds that you're going to pick one that'll go up from the point in time you get in instead of down. So if you just say, well, is the market risky? I say, no, people are.
Yeah.
People, but you know, people are risky. The market's not. It's kind of, but maybe a bad comparison, but is a gun dangerous? Well, only if you pick it up and use it. Laying on a desk, it's harmless, right? I mean, it just lays there, it'll lay there for 1,000 years. So I look at it a little different. I think we are the risk, the source of the risk. And I think that's what scares people, Cindy. I think that's what, you know, they get scared that if I get involved, will I execute? Will I be able to buy and sell things if I need to? And they doubt their abilities. And it scares them. And then they start negotiating. They go, well, that market's just not my cup of tea. You know, I've heard that from people. And I said, well, you just negotiated your way right out of being involved with that. You just said, that's not your cup of tea. I'm out of here.
And how often do we do that in life and miss out on opportunities generally, even beyond the stock market? This is great advice. And I love, as you're sort of sharing your principles with us, that how applicable this is to any negotiation that we have in life, whether personal or professional. And one of the things, as you were saying that, I like that, no, it's not risky, because if you follow that, if you do your preparation, if you put in the work, if you follow your rules, if you follow your values, and it strikes me that comes back again as well to that greed and pride, right? Whether in the stock market or in any negotiation, when we get too greedy, when we make it all about us, when there's too much ego involved. So what are some tips that you have about how to keep those deadly sins out of investing, if you will?
Well, there's several things you can do. I'll tell you the best thing you can do, or at least what I do, Cindy, is when, other than having the rules so that you can kind of gauge your activity, what am I doing versus how I say I should behave and act. But most of them are found in what I consider to be biblical advice. So, you know, when it comes to fear, we're told in the Bible, we really shouldn't be fearful. You know, we're not to be afraid of things. And you say, well, how can I not be afraid of things? Well, I can not be afraid of things by educating myself about those things, kind of like the snake we were talking about.
Yeah.
The same with greed. You know, the Bible says we shouldn't be greedy. You know, so there's a lot of advice in the Bible that I have found that just says, hey, Ron, you shouldn't be this way as a person. If you are, it's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
You know, and you say, well, can it hurt me? Yeah, it can hurt me. Like you would say in negotiating, those things come out, you know, pride of opinion. People don't like to be wrong. So you think, well, this isn't working. They don't agree with me. Am I wrong? Or are they wrong? You know, who's wrong? Is somebody wrong here? And nobody likes to be wrong. So all of a sudden you'll start, you know, changing maybe who you are. Are you willing to go a different direction? You know, honesty is another thing. Some of your things you talk about with flexibility and empathy, intuition, you know, that RFIT acronym. I love that. So I remember that. You've taught me something, Cindy. So I looked at that, I said, boy, that is good. So you have to do, those things to be, and I agree with you with negotiating, those qualities have to be in you. And you've got to recognize, if I was this way, I would
Yeah.
be better at negotiating and working things out with other people.
Yeah.
So I look at negotiating as that, it's
Yeah.
working. Sometimes we try to work it out with ourselves. We self-negotiate, but other times we're negotiating with people. Kids negotiate with their parents all the time.
Absolutely. Kids are actually pretty darn good natural negotiators. I mean, I think we could all go back and learn a few lessons again from tapping into our inner child in our negotiations. But it's funny you say that about seeing the parallels, because I find that same thing. As you're speaking, I'm sitting there percolating through my systems and models and going, this is so consistent with, what I call the art of feminine negotiation. I think this is great. And sticking with the Bible thing for a moment, do you have it? I mean, you probably already mentioned a few when you talk about your rules and that, but what would you call the sort of 10 commandments to be a good investor? You don't have to go through all 10, but what would you say are some of the top sort of commandments to really help you
I think
negotiate better?
those are really important to me. I think, Cindy, those 10 things, if a person reads through them, if they apply to you, I think you'll come out in pretty good shape personally. So the first one, I would keep it first. I'll pick like maybe three. I'll give you the
Okay.
top three that come to mind that I think if somebody started with these three, they'll be on a good road. We've kind of discussed it already a little bit. First one I'd say is keeping God first. That's the way I look at it is, don't seek his wisdom first, keep him first. A lot of things happen, good things happen by doing that, is he'll keep you from becoming greedy.
Yeah.
You won't fall in love with money. So money should be looked at as a tool. If you want to have more money, then increase your abilities. That's what the Bible tells us in Matthew. So, increase your abilities, look at money as a tool, and then make your goal to be a good steward. The good and faithful steward is Matthew tells us, the good and faithful servant or steward, and he's going to manage that money. So he's not going to gamble with it. He's going to learn to make good decisions as a manager. And you'd say, well, what would happen then? If he's a good manager, he'll have more money to manage over time. So if you want to have more to manage, become a good steward and keep God first. So that I tend to do that right there. I put that at the top, Cindy, and then I keep two would be having a proven system. I think without it, you don't have a chance.
Yeah.
I mean, you just don't. I don't think for a minute. If I had to go into this, Cindy, into the stock market, and then somebody said, Ron, you just have to kind of guess and throw darts like a monkey at the board, I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I would absolutely would not go. It'd scare me to death. Now I know what I know. So but I would have a proven system that I could use for certain. And then the third thing is that cutting losses, protecting that capital that you do have. That is your tool. You can't lose that tool or you're out of business. You don't have a business without that money. It is your tool. So there's a lot of other ones. You got to learn to honor the system. There's just lots of good ones in there. You got to learn to give back. I think people that can give money to other people have shown the ability to be generous and not greedy.
I like
that. It
that.
keeps you from being greedy by giving things to other people.
Yeah.
Kids are pretty good at it sometimes. Some kids aren't. I've seen some kids you're not going to get that candy from them for nothing, So, and back to that a little bit, it's funny, Cindy, the kids, when you watch them, is they're never afraid to ask.
Yes. Isn't that the truth?
You ever noticed that? I mean, they will ask.
I love it. I mean, most of the women that I teach, I'm like, you could take some lessons from kids. Go watch any kid in a grocery store with their parent. Kids ask for what they want. They are not afraid to ask for what they want. And they're not afraid to be persistent. And they're not afraid of getting a no. They don't seem to have that fear of rejection yet. It's a beautiful thing to watch.
So here's a good thing for women investors, Cindy. So I wanted to share this with you. As investors, women do better. And here's one I think they do. If you surveyed them, you find out that a woman that's an investor, if you went and talked to them on Wall Street that are involved, my guess is they do better overall. One big reason is, and I don't know if it involves negotiating so much as they are good at following directions. So take a guy driving somewhere he doesn't know where to go. Does he stop and ask for directions?
No, of course not.
He'll drive around the block 10 times. Yeah, but you let the woman drive the car. She's looking at Google Maps and she's just following directions.
Yeah.
She'll follow the directions and she'll get there. And if if she will not let you get lost, she'll say, hey, you need to follow it. What, don't you have directions? Don't you know where you're going? Oh, no, but I'll figure it out. I just
Yeah.
drive around the corner. Well, just keep going. Guys tend to just kind of ad lib at times,
Yeah.
and not, women will stick to it. So if you trained her well, she's probably going to do pretty well at
Yeah.
investing. I probably would take everything equal. I'd pick a woman doing better than a man.
That's interesting. And it's funny you mentioned the RFIT model, because that was one of the epiphanies that I had. It's like, oh, we all tend, both men and women, tend to stifle our feminine because we see it as a liability. But if you look at that RFIT model, 5 out of 6 of those qualities that make for the most effective leaders and negotiators are traits that most people consider feminine. So it's interesting that you apply that in the stock market. So we had talked about children. What about if you could go back and you were your like 18-year-old self with a few $1,000s? What is the single most important thing that you would do, that you would suggest?
Well, and I've told my kids, because my kids are 17 and 19.
Okay, perfect.
So here's the advice I gave them, which is I would have given anything, and I mean this wholeheartedly, Cindy, I would have given anything for me to go back and meet my college self.
Yeah.
If I could go back to him and talk to him, I'd say, boy, Ron, your dad put this thought into your mind that maybe you should consider that you value your money more than anybody else. Because he asked me that one day, hey, Ron, who cares more about your money than you do? I thought, probably nobody. I don't know of anybody. I probably care more about it than my dad did, because I have to use it to live, or whatever, or go to school. And I would tell myself, hey, Ron, there's big opportunities in the stock market. You're right, but you need to know this before you get started down that road. And I would tell my 18-year-old self, go get an education in the stock market, read books, find a guy that's been there, done that, and get him and live under his wing or her wing maybe, and find out what they do and how they do it, and get a good education. And I would want to know the things that I wrote down in my book, and William O'Neill. There's a couple of books that he wrote that I started with, How to Make Money in Stocks and The Successful Investor, and The Moses of Wall Street. Those 3 books. And I've told my kids, if you can learn those 3 books and put that into practice, you will have the thing whipped.
Okay, that is great advice. We'll make sure to put that in our show notes as well. Now, should current world news affect your investment decisions? I mean, I've heard all across the scale on that from people.
Well, here's my view on news, Cindy. It's what Mark Twain said. If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you're misinformed.
These days, especially, my gosh.
So what I would, and I've got a chapter in my book, and that's what it's called, news you lose.
Okay.
So what I've learned in my 30 plus years, one of the disasters that happens to people, and I spoke to a guy that this happened to. He worked for AP. I was talking to him one day, and he said something about, boy, this is a great place you got here, Ron. I'd like to have a place like that. I'm planning on retiring, but now I'm going to be another 5 or 10 years. I said, what do you mean? What happened? He said, well, I was in the stock market in 2000. I watched my retirement from 2000 to 03. I lost over half my money.
Wow. I
watched my retirement get cut in over half. He said, I stayed there though, Ron, and it came back. And so I'm talking to him, this is 2011-ish, right in there, 12 maybe. And he said, so I stayed and it came back. And by the time we made it to 2007, I was like, wow, okay, I'm coming back. Maybe I'll be able to retire when I want to.
Oh, no.
But he said, then we got into the banking crisis in 2008. And he said, down it went again. He said, I got killed. I lost about half my money. He said, I can't take it anymore. I can't afford to keep losing my money. I mean, how much can I realistically lose? I'll never get to retire. So he sold out and he never got back in.
Yeah. Oh.
So I said, well, the news part, Cindy, is what I've realized is that the news often doesn't match up with bull and bear markets. I've noticed that in bear markets, a lot of times when everything seems bad, the market will find a bottom and take off, kind of like it's been doing since January this year. And people don't understand how can it recover when they're listening to all the bad news. Things that are going on in our country.
Yeah, no, I would say, well, and it's interesting you say that because I think that news piece is, if you growing up, they had true investigative journalism, right? And now everybody's talking about fake news, and you really don't see a lot of investigative journalism out there. It's a lot of the same stuff, rhetoric being just put out there and information pushed, and you got the fact farms or whatever the heck they call them, the disinformation. I mean, I think more people now are looking to comedians to get more accurate news reports than they are to the actual news. It's kind of terrifying.
At least you'll be entertained anyway, right?
Yeah, I know. I remember you saw that shift around the time, I think it was like Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert,
Yeah.
and people would be watching those shows, the comedians, to try and get a more accurate spin on it. It was like, oh, good grief, how things have turned
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. Well, I think didn't you mention I think it was you mentioned Will Smith with Chris Rock, that slap.
Yes, the slap heard around the world.
And
God.
I loved it. I loved how you looked at that. And it's options of what can we do? And there were several choices, even there. And it just, it makes you wonder, why do people make some of the decisions?
Yeah.
Which leads me to another thing, Cindy. This to me I found has been enlightening to me over the last several years. This is something I've just thought about in the last few years, is that when it comes, and this is life in general, but especially in the stock market, we can make decisions in one of about three ways.
Yeah.
Or we can take actions. And I think of Will Smith in that scenario you described, and I think, well, where did he fall into these three? So if I could go through them real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the first one? It would be react.
Yes.
So people can react to things. We do it instinctively, right? We don't really think about what we do. We just react. So I label react as acting before thinking.
Yeah.
So we actually do something. We just kind of react to it. We didn't think about how to react. We just reacted based on our instinct.
Yeah.
So we didn't really think before we acted. We acted before we thought. The second one, though, is responding. That's where I think I see you fitting, Cindy. Most of what you talk about it's acting after thinking.
Yeah.
So our reacting is acting before thinking. Responding is acting after thinking.
Yeah.
And that's where we get to think about what's taking place. How should I respond? What are my options? How should I go about this? What's best for me? What would be best for them? And you get a chance to think about things so you can respond to some information or a situation you're put in. And then the third one is what I label as ludicrous actions. And maybe somebody would throw Will Smith into that, but it's acting without thinking. So so you got acting before you think, acting after you think, then you got acting without thinking. And sometimes we find ourselves there. And in the stock market, those three you got to be careful of, because ludicrous decisions are those. You take action. You didn't think at all. There is no thinking involved. Before, there's none done after. It's just, you just fly with it. And the responding is a better place to be.
Gosh, I like that model a lot. When you talked about that reacting, one of the other models that I have, there's the AOFN, and one I call the no fear model. And so much of what you said today, Ron, just really parallels that. It's like FEAR, about fear, managing that fear. E is ego, managing that ego. A is attachment, being too attached to things, not, as you say, cutting your losses. And R is reactivity, right? Thinking in advance, what are some of the things that are going to cause me to be reactive so you don't end up in that mode? So I love your three possible ways to respond. I think it's fantastic. So you have given us such incredible, great insights here in the short time that we had. I can't believe how quickly it's gone. I normally end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? And this doesn't have to have anything to do with what we've talked about here today about negotiation or otherwise, just one of those moments when you look at things differently.
Shift. I think it was the big one happened for me, Cindy. I mean, just this is my gut reaction, because that's a great question. Hadn't really ever thought about that too much, but a shift probably for me was when I thought about money differently as a tool, and I stopped treating it as something that it shouldn't be and elevating it into a be all, end all, solve all type of a thing. And it became a more like, hey, Ron, this is just a tool. This is a thing you're going to need. And I kind of live now, Cindy, as I share this with my group, is money is important, but it's not more important than God. So I've learned to put it on a different plane. I treat it as a tool. It's a necessary tool for living. most people, I don't make my own clothes or my cars or build my own houses and
Yeah.
my own 2x4s and all that stuff. So you need money. And I've just learned to kind of shift it into a different place and treat it as more as a tool,
Mm.
and try not to let myself become attached to kind of like Howard Hughes. They asked him, well, how much money would be enough, Howard? How much money would be enough? And he said, well, just a little bit more.
Yeah.
You know? And so if we let that happen, that's where we can find ourselves. It's always just a little bit more versus I have a tool, use my tool to the best of my abilities. If I do well, I'll have more of that tool. That lets me live different if I choose to.
Oh, I love that insight. I think that's a powerful shift. And especially these days, a message that we could use more. You know, we've come to covet money, I think, in ways that are not healthy. And I love that you said, you know, money is not more important than, and I would add to that, you know, money is not more important than our family. Money is not more important than our integrity or our values, right? It's, I think that's a great model to live our life. So really quickly in the time we have, like, tell our listeners there about your book and where they can get it.
Yeah, well, the book you can get on Amazon. It's The Moses Wall Street's the title of it. Can be found on Amazon. If you go to the website, you can actually you can download a PDF for free. So if somebody wants to read it,
generous.
You can download a PDF there. You can just go to it'd be www.rontank.com, and you can click on the book tab at the top, or you can add /book to the end of that address and get directly to that page. So you can just click on a link and download it, and off you go. That's the best way. If somebody wants to send an email, they can to mosesofwallstreet@rontank.com. I'm open to emails if somebody wants to. Always love to hear from people. So.
That's fantastic. And we'll make sure to put that all in the show notes for our listeners. So again, if you've been wanting to get your dip your feet into the stock market and to be able to learn a little bit more about it, remember that Ron does educationals around that. He does coaching on that. Definitely check out his book and check out Ron. So and again, that's rontank.com if you want to check out his website. And thanks so much for being here, Ron. I've learned a lot, and I love your approach. I think it's fabulous.
Thanks, Sandy. It was fun. I enjoyed it. So thanks for having me.
And thanks for doing your homework. You surprised me. You know about my stuff as well. I don't get that too often. So that was a nice, pleasant surprise. And for our listeners, I'm sure you got lots of value from this episode. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that, and pass this on to other people who could benefit from this. Because whether you're interested in investing in the stock market, there's been all kinds of little gold nuggets here. And some of the lessons that Ron shared with you today, I think, apply in negotiating your best life generally. Before we sign off today, I just want to share some ways we can work together. If you happen to be looking to up level your negotiation skills, I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind or VIP experiences. It'll help you leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting, check out artoffemininenegotiation.com. And also make sure to grab a copy of my book as well as Ron's, and that's The Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, as always, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.